The so-called Dublin regulation is the only instrument that attempts to coordinate European countries. It establishes who should process an asylum application, and in particular that this responsibility falls upon the first country through which an asylum seeker entered the European Union, but this regulation doesn't say anything about how asylum applications should be processed. This is independently determined by each European country. European countries differ to some extent with respect to the recognition rate, that is to say, the share of asylum applications for which protection according to the Geneva Convention or another form of subsidiary protection is eventually granted. But the recognition rate mostly reflects the evolution of security conditions in the countries of origin of the asylum seekers, so that differences across European countries in a given time period are relatively modest. What varies greatly across European countries is rather the time that is required to reach a final decision on an asylum application, what I will be referring to as the processing time. Why this varies across countries? Well, because this is, to a large extent, the result of deliberate actions and choices taken by the country that receives the asylum applications. For instance, around the time of the famous Wir schaffen das speech by Angela Merkel in the summer of 2015, Germany was taking deliberate measures to face the increase in asylum applications by scaling up its processing capacity. What I mean, for instance, is that within a 2-year period, Germany increased by almost a factor of 4 the number of employees of the BAMF, the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees. And this resulted, for instance, in a reduction from around 8 months to 2 months in the time required to reach a final decision on an asylum application lodged by a Syrian asylum seeker. Other European countries around the same time didn't take explicit actions, and so the increase in asylum applications resulting into a dramatic increase in the time required to reach a final decision on asylum applications. You might think, well, this is not so much important because in the end what matters is rather the final decision, whether refugee status is granted or denied. But this is not the case, because processing time matters both for the asylum seeker herself and for the host society. Why is this the case? Well, the existing empirical evidence in the literature suggests that a longer processing time results into a prolonged phase of uncertainty with respect to the legal status of the asylum seeker, and this can delay some crucial investment in destination-specific skills, such as learning the local language, and this in turn deteriorates the future labor market prospect of the refugee. And this is clearly detrimental both for the refugee herself and for the host country. In a sense, the absence of coordination, and so the heterogeneity in the recognition rate to a modest extent, and in the processing time to a large extent across European countries, opens up an opportunity for the econometrician to try to understand how these factors correlate with the distribution of asylum applications across European countries. So we rely on data from Eurostat from January 2008 to June 2017 to understand what are the determinants of the distribution of asylum applications. And what we see is that, unsurprisingly, destination countries that are characterized by a higher recognition rate tend to attract a larger number of asylum applications, while the effect of the processing time is ambiguous and it varies across origins. If you take an origin, such as Syria in the past few years, where citizens face a very high probability of being granted refugee status once they apply, then a longer processing time discourages applications. On the other hand, if you take a country such as Albania or Serbia, whose citizens have a limited to non-existent probability of obtaining refugee protection, then a longer processing time is actually associated with an increase in the number of applications coming from these origins. I think that indeed this heterogeneity is a form of inefficiency because some European countries might be tempted to deliberately scale down their capacity to process asylum applications, thus delaying final decisions, and thus making their own countries less attractive for asylum seekers. And such a dynamic would be clearly detrimental for the effective protection that Europe as a whole is able to offer to people that are fleeing from conflict-affected countries. And so what could be done to limit this inefficiency and this possible race to the bottom? Well, a first step could be the establishment and adoption of a unique list of safe countries of origin at the European level. A second thing that could be pursued, or a second attempt, could be to consider relying on EU budget to, as it's currently done, for instance, for Frontex to secure the external borders of the European Union, to have sufficient resources to ensure a timely and accurate processing of asylum applications across European countries.